In mid-2007, the global financial system exploded. Newspaper headlines and television sets across the country resounded with reports of what was soon widely referred to as the subprime mortgage crisis. The abysmal losses of Countrywide Financial and American Home Mortgage became the talk of the town almost overnight. The failure was not of pieces of the system, however, but of the system itself. This was not an unforeseen event. Several days before the reports of crisis burst into the news, economist Lyndon LaRouche delivered an international address signifying the close of the post-FDR global financial and monetary system.
There is no possibility of a non-collapse of the present financial system. None. It's finished now. The present financial system cannot continue to exist under any circumstances, under any presidency, under any leadership, or any leadership of nations. Only a fundamental and sudden change in the world monetary financial system will prevent a general, immediate, chain reaction type of collapse. At what speed, we don't know, but it will go on, and it will be unstoppable. And the longer it goes on before coming to an end, the worse things will get.
In the ensuing period, though the media frenzy had appeared to dissipate, the terror in the financial world did not. Rather than following LaRouche's initiative to break from the failing system and support his Homeowners and Bank Protection Act, federal leaders, under pressure from Wall Street, clung to measures which would only prolong the death throes of the financial system until the end of the year, at the expense of the population. Upon the arrival of the new year, in the aftermath of further unprecedented money-pumping measures taken by central banks around the globe at the behest of City of London financiers, political solutions began to surface left and right. Presidential candidates, elected officials, and economists raced to reveal their stimulus packages, further perpetuating the bailout of the already bankrupt system. On January 17th, 6 months after his assessment of the end of the world financial system, LaRouche again spoke out above the clamor, identifying the full scope and implications of the crisis.
Each day now, since January 3rd, the crisis has been expanding in magnitude at an accelerating rate. What you think is the extent of the crisis today is the measures I propose are not taken will become much worse by an order of magnitude on the next week, and the week after that, and the week after that, until the whole system grinds into a collapse, probably sometime during this year. And I'm talking about a global collapse, not a collapse just of the transatlantic English-speaking community.
And Son, are you on the phone with us?
I am on the phone, Joe, yes.
The following week ended in the last hurrah of the Federal Reserve, a drastic cut in the interest rates, a clear move of utter desperation. LaRouche identified this as the culminating event of a commitment made by the transatlantic English-speaking world toward a new phase of crisis, a chain reaction of global hyperinflationary collapse, comparable to that which struck Germany in 1923, terminating in the fascist regimes of Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. In this presentation, we shall unfold to the viewer the process by which we have come to such a point in history, and how we may rise to the occasion of regaining America's proper role in the world, rather than shrinking into littleness and watching as the great experiment of our founding fathers is relegated to the dustbin of history as the world enters a new dark age. We urge the viewer to watch as if his future depended on it, because in a very real sense, it does. In the second half of the 19th century, a new dynamic was beginning to express itself in the political landscape of the world. Previous to this, the world had been dominated by a system of empires, typified by the British Empire's commitment to thriving off the sheer brute labor power of uneducated, enslaved populations. In the name of free trade, the British East India Company enforced an economic policy devised to maintain the dependence of its colonies upon its control of maritime shipping throughout the world. By flooding foreign markets with cheap goods, they would force other countries to devalue their labor to the point where their only recourse was either the employment of slave labor or the elimination of manufacturing altogether. By these means, Britain's colonies were to forever remain vassals, with the sole purpose of supplying raw materials to the empire.
The British Empire ruled by controlling trade in raw materials. So they would have colonies around the world in which they would loot these colonies. But the colonies were never allowed to develop beyond the level at which they needed to develop to make the looting of their raw materials efficient. So you'd build railroads from the mine to the coast, but you'd never build railroads across the continent to tie the continent together as a whole. That you'd build up certain local aristocracies, but that's for the purposes of providing the political protection for your looting operations. But it's all about looting and extraction. You don't want these things to become nations, because if they become nations, they start to look at these resources as theirs instead of yours. And that's a problem if you're trying to steal them.
In the post-colonial United States Republic, however, there existed a better vision for the future. American system economist and advisor to President Abraham Lincoln, Henry C. Carey, drew a stark contrast when he wrote in 1851,
"Two systems are before the world. One looks to underworking the Hindu and sinking the rest of the world to his level. The other to raising the standard of man throughout the world to our level. One looks to pauperism, ignorance, depopulation, and barbarism. The other to increasing wealth, comfort, intelligence, and civilization. One looks towards universal war, the other towards universal peace. One is the English system, the other we may be proud to call the American system, for it is the only one ever devised, the tendency of which was that of elevating while equalizing the condition of man throughout the world. Such is the true mission of the people of these United States. To raise the value of labor throughout the world, we need only to raise the value of our own."
In 1865, the young nation, the United States of America, under the leadership of President Abraham Lincoln, triumphed over the concerted efforts of the British Empire to break her apart through support of the Confederacy and other means of subversion. The American system, based upon freeing and fostering the creative capacities of mankind, thrived upon a culture of scientific advancement and development of basic economic infrastructure. A vast railway grid, stretching from ocean to ocean, reinforced the internal sovereignty of the nation and secured independence from any external sea power. In this way, the United States became the first continental sovereign nation-state to establish itself on the map in the entire span of recorded history.
Now, a nation is an entirely different thing. A nation, if you look at our Constitution and Declaration of Independence, where it says clearly that the purpose of what we're doing is to protect the general welfare of the population. that we're all in this together, that everybody gets protected, that we want to build a nation according to a concept which promotes culture, which promotes the development of the individuals and the creative potential of the human mind, because that's your real asset.
The international consequences of America's achievement precipitated rapidly. Just as Carey had foreseen, the popularity of the American system spread throughout the globe as other nations perceived its successful thwarting of the British Empire. Nations such as Germany, Russia, and Japan underwent rapid development. Germany, in particular, began to develop a vast network of rail and canals. With such an immense system of infrastructure, it quickly became a leader in industry throughout not only Europe, but the entire world. The productive output of Germany's Ruhr region was second only to the powerhouse of America, the Pittsburgh region. With Germany's exports growing, so did its maritime power, and as it laid plans to fund the construction of a continuous rail grid from Berlin to Baghdad, it emerged as a significant threat to the long-standing British world dominance.
But if you promote the creative potential of the human mind, then you also destroy the world in which the empires operate. Because anybody who's got a brain and can see a better way is not going to tolerate these things. And that when the United States, as you saw after the Civil War, when we got the American system up and running and started exporting it to other countries around the world, we were transforming the world. And we were the greatest threat to this system on the planet. And they've been after us to take it down ever since.
Though America could no longer be subverted by military means, such tactics were still fully deployable by the British against other nations. With the 1888 accession of Queen Victoria's imprudent grandson, Wilhelm II, to the German throne, the British Empire needed only to set the trap. Under the maintenance of his uncle, England's King Edward VII, Willie had no difficulty in falling for it. Earlier in the 19th century, Britain's Lord Palmerston, notorious for his foreign manipulations, had already prearranged the ploy. Were any conflict to break out between Germany and France, Palmerston well knew that the Belgian territory would be a crucial strategic position for German success. Thus, under his instigation, Belgium was set up as a neutral country, meaning that should any nation violate Belgium's border, that nation would immediately become the target of British aggressions. Britain had but to lure them in. Germany, however, had grown to such a power that Britain and France alone would not be capable of defeating her.
The British method is to get other people to go out and fight a war and kill each other. And they then come in and pick up the pieces after the people have exhausted themselves in killing each other.
Once the British drew Russia into an alliance against Germany after Kaiser Wilhelm II disintegrated the alliance with Russia, the supplemental power the British sought to wage a two-front war against Germany was secured. All that remained to be introduced was the spark. The convenient assassination of Austrian heir apparent Archduke Franz Ferdinand, carried out by means of Serbian nationalists, ignited the situation, pitting the Germans and Austrians against the Russians and French. The British, up to the last minute, maintained a public appearance of having no interest in the continental conflicts brewing in the summer of 1914. Yet, their intent was unrelentingly to crush Germany at all costs.
So this is the way it happened. But the purpose was to destroy, geopolitically as they call it, to destroy continental Europe, continental Eurasia, to maintain it under the control of the British Empire. And using whatever lies, whatever excuses and so forth they could use, whatever motives they could cook up to get this thing going. The essential thing is what's called geopolitics. To maintain the maritime power of the British system as the world empire. Always been their policy.
As World War I broke out in August 1914, and as all the intentions were unveiled, Kaiser Wilhelm II bewailed,
"The world will be engulfed in the most terrible of wars, the ultimate aim of which is the ruin of Germany. England, France, and Russia have conspired for our annihilation. That is the naked truth of the situation which was slowly but surely created by Edward VII. The encirclement of Germany is at last an accomplished fact. We have run our heads into the noose."
In the aftermath of Germany's military defeat, the British intention to stop the spread of the American system's potential was now revealed. On condition of the 1918 armistice, the Army and Navy were completely dismantled, and all of Germany's locomotives and train cars were extracted from the country. The 1919 peace conference in Paris excluded Germany from the negotiations. The full burden for all damages incurred through the war were heaped upon Germany. As an initial installment, 20 billion gold marks were to be paid to the Allied victors in the form of German bonds, redeemable either in gold marks or physical goods. Germany was to be stripped of its entire merchant marine fleet. It was to produce 200,000 tons of ships each year, along with reconstruction equipment for the Allied nations. 100,000 head of cattle were to be relinquished to France and Belgium alone, along with hundreds of thousands of other farm animals. This would occur in tandem with a continued naval blockade, which had already reduced the food intake level of the German people to half that of before the war. Not only were Germany's materials to be extracted, but key border territories were to be ceded to surrounding countries. The Alsace-Lorraine region, possessing the most developed canal system for transport of materials and products from the Rhine River, as well as large deposits of iron ore and coal, was to be turned over to France. Upper Silesia, another choke point of industry and transport, was to be ceded to Poland. The sudden loss of manpower, resources, rich farmland, and factories would slash the ability to meet the reparations requirements. These were the terms of the Versailles Treaty. Were Germany to refuse them, the defenseless nation was threatened with invasion and occupation. In the words of the German government, they had no choice but to sign their own death sentence.
If you want to destroy a nation, you blame it for something. It's that simple. This guy must be killed. Why? Well, I've got to tell you this later, why the reasons. We've got to go out and kill him now.
In the period between 1919 and 1921, Germany proceeded in forced march to fulfill the payments. The German government printed paper Reichsmarks to buy up the greater part of produced goods, in order to hand them over for reparations. Thus, since most of the production went toward payment rather than the development of the nation, nothing remained as a foundation to give value to the currency. In May of 1921, the London-steered Reparations Committee unveiled their second set of terms, declaring that Germany must pay 132 billion gold marks, an impossible sum. In October, after the failed attempt of German Foreign Minister Walter Rathenau to rework debt agreements with France, the Allies increased the pressure to pay the debt. In order to offset the loss of physical capital, the government was forced to incur more debt than the original reparations. By the end of the year, the built-up pressure of the debt and the consequent money printing became apparent, as 262 marks were needed to buy a single US dollar. In response to mounting economic pressure applied at the League of Nations gathering in Genoa, Italy, Foreign Minister Rathenau met with Russian representatives in nearby Rapallo, where a treaty was signed which would relieve Germany of the portion of its reparation payments due to Russia and improve relations between the two countries. This positive turn offered an escape from the ever-tightening British noose. However, such a promising agreement was not tolerated. 2 weeks after the signing of the Rapallo Treaty, Rathenau was assassinated. Within 4 weeks of the Rathenau murder, the mark dropped from 345 to the dollar to 1,254. By the autumn of 1922, the ability to pay the financial debt was dwindling. In the face of collapsing wages and the continued need to service the debt, the government was forced to rely on unrestrained money printing, and the mark continued its fall. This dramatic increase in monetary aggregate required bills with higher face values than ever before. In January 1923, despite breakthroughs by Germany in diplomatic initiatives towards reworking the debt agreements, the Ruhr region, which produced 3/4 of Germany's coal, iron, and steel, was invaded by Allied troops. Refusing to yield to military occupation, the German government encouraged the entire working population of the Ruhr to go on strike. Production was completely shut down. The loss of this strategic area was beyond devastating and had 3 related consequences. First, the severing of the Ruhr from the remainder of the German economy was a conclusive stripping of the income stream that had been used to feed the financial debt. Second, the rest of Germany suffered huge increases in unemployment. Third, in order to financially support the entire working population on strike, the government was forced to further accelerate the printing presses. Under these conditions, the concept of saving money became an impossibility for the German people. On the contrary, the more quickly it could be spent, the better, so as not to be left with a handful of worthless Reichsmarks. Wheelbarrows became the common mode of transporting money to buy essential foodstuffs, which were becoming more expensive by the minute. In the face of such circumstances, many sought refuge in the wild frenzy of a culturally degenerate fantasy world. Others, equally deluded, engaged in obsessive gambling and speculation, some attempting to make a profit by betting against the Reichsmark in the currency markets. In the spring of 1923, inflation was in full bloom. By June, nothing could stop the mark. Waves of strike broke out due to collapsing wages. Unemployment skyrocketed. All aspects of daily life became focused solely upon survival, all savings disappeared, and nearly all income was consumed in simply preventing starvation. Printing presses were run day and night to keep up with the demands of inflation. The hyperbolic expansion of circulating marks was mirrored in their devaluation. By the end of the year, the mark had lost all its value. The German population was drowned in a sea of worthless money. the magnitude and rapidity of this blowout of the German economy necessitated the invention of a new term, hyperinflation. With a disintegrated monetary system, Germany had nowhere to turn save a political solution. Yet the question of whether this solution would preserve Germany as a nation-state or whether it would become a mere geopolitical tool was left entirely up to the British Empire to answer. The so-called solution to the Weimar madness was to bring in Hjalmar Horace Greeley Schacht, German by birth but not by breed. His closest collaborators consisted wholly of Wall Street and London international financial circles, such as John Foster Dulles, J.P. Morgan, Averell Harriman, and Bank of England head Montague Norman. Loyal to his kind, he catalyzed the further dismantling of Germany as a nation-state. As newly appointed currency commissioner and soon to be president of the Reichsbank, Schacht introduced a new currency, the Rentenmark, which was fixed in value. At an exchange rate of 1 trillion marks for 1 Rentenmark, citizens handed in their entire money supply for a handful of Rentenmarks. Schacht's policies brought an end to the hyperinflation, but only by means of imposing a severe hyperdeflation, designed to further secure the payment of the Versailles reparations. Thus, instead of feeding the monstrous debt with worthless ink on paper, the reparations would now be directly stripped off the backs of the already starved population. In the name of balancing the budget, any type of so-called useless spending was to be cut. Cuts in credit to industries and a dismissal of 397,000 civil servants were accompanied by the enforcement of high taxes and increased union busts. In addition, Schacht's entrance into power was accompanied with the full realization of his long-planned privatization of all German industry. New York and London financial vultures and their international syndicates quickly swept in to pick the bones of what remained of the coal, steel, iron, and chemical industries. Those same industries, under their new foreign controllers, would soon become infamous for their inhuman labor policies. As any moderately sane people would actively resist such inhumane policies, Schacht searched for an entity who would have the stomach to adequately enforce their execution. The remedy for the inadequacy of the current police force to carry out Schacht's purpose finally came in 1933, when the London and Wall Street cabal merged in slime mold fashion to finance the election of Adolf Hitler. Europe was again launched into savage austerity and world war.
Germany was intentionally destroyed by the French and the British, essentially the British. It was intentionally destroyed. They say, die. That was their intention. It was a geopolitical move where the intention was to destroy the independent power of nations of Eurasia and in part of the United States. The United States was taken as a partner under Wilson in this operation, together with Teddy Roosevelt. So we were taken in on this thing. So we went out to destroy continental Europe. We picked on Germany, destroyed Germany. So what was imposed on Germany at Versailles and later was its intent to destroy the country. And then, in general, they used that as a basis for creating a fascist system. They intended to establish a fascist system, a world fascist system. And it was the British who put the Nazis in power. It was not a spontaneous thing of Germany. It was the British stuck them in power, deliberately.
The process set into motion in Germany was one that economist Lyndon LaRouche described as the triple curve. The threefold process of feeding a ballooning financial bubble, using an expanding money supply looted from a collapsed physical economy, represents a single typical collapse function. Like the separation of the boundary layer during transonic flight, the act of divorcing the money supply from the physical economy generates a self-feeding shock front. This shock front develops rapidly until it reaches a critical point of instability, where the rate of increase in the monetary aggregates surpasses that of the financial aggregates. This singularity marks the transition between two entirely distinct spaces, where the governing processes on one side no longer apply on the other. As physicist and mathematician Bernhard Riemann recognized, this type of discontinuity is characteristic of all physical processes. Significantly, it is the most characteristic feature of the anti-entropic development of human physical economies. All human modes of operation constitute what is called a phase space, a constructive geometric space of variable curvature and dimensionality representing the domain of all potential activity, in short, a set of physical laws. In a human economy, the boundary conditions governing these laws are represented by the degree of technological development, typified here by available energy resources. A wood-burning civilization has a necessary upper limit, not only on their total energy output, but on the possibility for that resource to sustain a growing population. If man were merely an animal, the depletion of that resource base would result in periodic fluctuations in the human population, a cycle of growth and collapse, maintaining the human population at constant median value, like that of every other living creature on the earth. On the contrary, however, the characteristic of human economic development is to surpass each encountered boundary by the introduction of newly discovered principles, transitioning from resource base to resource base, forming, in effect, a continuous curve of discontinuities. This is the reflection in the large of the human creative capacity which empire seeks to eliminate.
They had an operation to destroy us going into World War II, where they want this global fascist movement. And there was an attempt to, you had the planned coup in the United States against Franklin Roosevelt, for example, but you had Mussolini, you had Hitler, you had these fascist movements in all sorts of places around the world. But they blew it because Hitler was out of control and he moved the wrong way. He came after Europe instead of going after and destroying Russia. So that caused a problem. Then they had to defend themselves against Hitler when they had been planning on using Hitler as a weapon against Russia. And the other problem was that the American system rose up to bite them in the form of FDR, who took the Constitution seriously and intervened to protect the nation state. So that after the war, we wound up as the most powerful nation on the face of the earth. Industrially, we were strong. Nobody could touch us. Militarily, no one could touch us. Okay, so they came out of the war in exactly the opposite shape that they had planned. Instead of running the world, they were on the run. So their response was to try to bring us down from within, because that's all they had.
Particularly during the period immediately following the Second World War, it would not have been possible to destroy the American system militarily within the United States itself. The British Hitler Project had failed, and the empire had been forced to come crawling to the United States for assistance in stopping their Frankenstein monster. But this was no longer the United States of Ku Klux Klan booster Woodrow Wilson. American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's economic measures had curbed the banking establishment on Wall Street, and his recovery programs had created an explosion of technological and economic optimism that far exceeded what the British had sought to destroy in Germany. To stop this, it was necessary for the British to re-establish the influence of their agents within the United States. On March 5, 1946, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill delivered a speech at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, which later became known as his Iron Curtain speech.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere. And all are subject, in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and in some cases increasing measure of control.
With this, a project was launched to unleash in the United States the same type of fascism as the British had established throughout Europe in the prior decade. McCarthyism, better termed Trumanism, turned the U.S. into a police state. It was generally recognized by intelligent thinkers that this was a repeat of the fascist terror that had just been defeated in Europe. These police state conditions prepared the generation just returning from the war to raise what has been, without question, the most gullible generation the United States has ever produced.
These boys greet their dad as though they are genuinely glad to see him, as though they had really missed being away from him during the day and are anxious to talk to him. This is the time for pleasant discussion in a thoroughly relaxed mood. They don't pick this time of the day to spring unpleasant surprises on Dad. If they have disagreeable news, they'll postpone the discussion until another time. And this is no time to dun Father for a raise in your allowance, new clothes, or argue about other financial matters.
The baby boomers were less a generation than they were a product of an extensive social manipulation.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You'll excuse the fact that I'm out of breath, but about 10 or 15 minutes ago, a tragic thing, from all indications at this point, has happened in the city of Dallas. Let me quote to you this. President Kennedy and Governor John Connally have been cut down by assassins' bullets in downtown Dallas.
As had been done in Europe earlier, the shock trauma of a series of traumatic events were used to create a broken and malleable generation, ripe for the kinds of social engineering required to uproot the type of American optimism which the global financial elites, centered in the City of London, so despised. This created the conditions for the launching of the rock, drugs, sex, existentialist counterculture which dominated the baby boomer generation. This time, unlike Germany after World War I, there was no need for a military to enforce the destruction of American industry. The 68ers had been imbued with a passionate hatred for the human creative capacity, a passion which had only to be steered by the manipulation of popular culture.
So 1968, there's another event, a speech at the Bilderberger meeting in 1968 by a man named George Ball. And George Ball was a member of the steering committee of the Bilderbergers, which was a primarily European oligarchic fascist organization. Prince Bernhard, the Nazi from the Netherlands, and others, we've said a lot about the Bilderbergers. He was a banker, a senior banker at Lehman Brothers. All right. Eastern establishment, former State Department diplomat, a very important man in our government. So what George Ball was laying out was not some theory about what we ought to do. What George Ball was doing was telling people, here's the new plan. And the new plan was something he called the World Company. Now, the idea of the World Company is that nation-states cannot be trusted to manage the world because they are selfish. They look out for their own self-interest. That some nations think that just because they happen to sit on top of raw materials, that those raw materials belong to them.
And we all know that in a period of Malthusian shortages, of overpopulation of scarce resources, that this can't be tolerated. You can't allow these selfish nations to hold the world hostage. So we have to fix that. We're going to fix that with a corporate structure, because the corporation isn't bound by these kinds of old-fashioned, silly ideas. The corporation is more interested in efficiency. We're getting the raw materials and distributing them in the most efficient way, which means at the most profit.
Even as some of the polymorphically perverse hippies of the 60s transformed throughout the 70s into the greed-is-good capitalists of the 80s, they never lost their utter aversion to all things technological. The real technological optimism of Roosevelt's recovery was supplanted by the fraud of information technology. Science was replaced by science fiction, and the boomers sought to make their programmed fantasies a reality. The cultural willingness to accept the first phase of the triple curve collapse function had been established. Upon accomplishing this, the financial establishment launched a full-scale takedown of the social and economic reforms created by Franklin Roosevelt. Throughout the course of the 1970s, a series of operations were run with the intention of replacing the U.S. physical economy with a massive parasitical debt bubble. In 1971, a grouping of financier interests led by George Shultz and Felix Rohatyn made the decision to officially decouple the dollar from gold. This marked the end of the Bretton Woods system of international development as it had been established by Roosevelt.
We will press for the necessary reforms to set up an urgently needed new international monetary system.
The dollar was now officially detached from the physical economy and free to be transformed entirely into an instrument of speculation. Currency exchange rates were permitted to fluctuate wildly, and long-term investment into national development projects became an impossibility for the underdeveloped areas of the globe. This was consolidated in the period between 1973 and 1974, when a staged oil crisis was used to create the so-called euro-dollar market. Royal Dutch Shell and its bankers, Rothschild and Felix Rohatyn's Lazard, set up the oil spot market and made the dollar the currency of international oil trade. This raised the value of the dollar, while at the same time placing a huge pool of dollars into the hands of speculators outside of the United States, to be used as the major instrument in the attacks which were to follow. Throughout the 1970s, the very notion of a physically productive enterprise was eaten up in a series of so-called mergers and acquisitions. In reality, this represented a steady rebuilding of the kind of cartelization which Roosevelt had worked so hard to destroy. The legitimate American entrepreneurial enterprise was slowly overrun by profit-obsessed mega-corporations. Leveraged buyouts of businesses became the norm. Formerly productive industries were looted and turned into short-term money-making machines. As in Weimar Germany under the conditions of Versailles, the value of financial aggregates, again in the form of debt and stock market valuation, began to spiral upwards out of control. In 1975, Felix Rohatyn, playing the role of a modern-day Hjalmar Schacht, was appointed head of the Municipal Assistance Corporation, Big Mac, in charge of handling the financial crisis which New York City was then experiencing. Aside from the brutal austerity policies implemented by Rohatyn during that process, this set the standard for the ultimate aims of Rohatyn and his financial controllers. Private money would now be allowed to run public policy. Finally, in 1979, Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker instituted a policy which the Council on Foreign Relations had dubbed the controlled disintegration of the U.S. economy. This took the form of an enormous hike in the interest rate, a move which devastated the U.S. productive sector. With the rate of interest on loans in the range of 21% per year, long-term investments became an impossibility. Any business venture with the intent of promoting physical development was doomed to failure, and short-term money-making schemes thrived. This marked the beginning of a period of absolute lunacy economically and culturally.
Basically, in the 1980s, you had all of these rules that were designed to protect the economy and protect citizens from these rapacious banking practices were dismantled. And the policies were set just the other way to favor this sort of thing and encourage it. And so this continued. By the end of the 1980s, the whole system was bankrupt.
During this period, one of the major firewalls established by Franklin Roosevelt to defend the American people was deliberately targeted and destroyed. The savings and loan banks, barred from speculative activities by Roosevelt in order to ensure the availability of low-interest, long-term loans for housing and other needs, were opened to predatory speculation. The model for the modern stock market was established, nominally, by Michael Milken, who used mafia money to build up Las Vegas, inventing the so-called junk bond.
The case of Michael Milken illustrates how the system actually works, because what Milken did, and I think it was about 1978, was to set up in Beverly Hills, California, an office of Drexel Burnham Lambert, the investment bank, which was based in New York. And the Beverly Hills office was a place where he started selling junk bonds. He created the junk bond business. And a junk bond is, by definition, a corporate security which has a credit rating of less than investment grade. So it's commonly called a junk bond or a high yield bond. Now, to understand it, you have to take it out of the realm of a business story or a financial story. It's not really about bond ratings and things like that. And what they would do is that Milken would go to a company, let's say a casino, Steve Wynn's casino, because he helped build Las Vegas. And he would say, okay, we can raise money for you. You want to build a fancy new casino, we'll raise money by selling bonds. And since up to that point, the bond market had been only investment grade, blue chip companies. People thought of bonds as being very safe. So this idea that you would have these companies that might not really make it, that were somewhat shaky, issue bonds, this was a new thing.
Milken's monsters, as they were known, became the model for stock market speculation, finally obliterating the already thin line between organized crime and Wall Street. By the end of the 1980s, the entire U.S. economy was in a state of collapse. This collapse culminated with Black Monday in October of 1987, when the markets plunged 20%, setting the stage for the creation of the largest financial bubble in history by the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, who had been installed shortly before the collapse.
At that point, Greenspan said, I'm coming in, I'm going to fix everything. And he started this particular hyperinflationary system. He said, we can invent money. It was based on Michael Milken and Michael Milken's kind of experiment in California. Michael Milken went to prison for that. Huh? Greenspan legalized it and expanded it.
Again, an increasing flow of money, looted from the collapsing physical economy, was required to feed this ballooning bubble. This time, however, the money was not paper, but digital. And this time, The effects of hyperinflation were partially masked for the American population by the introduction of a policy of what was called euphemistically globalization. Under globalization, the United States trade policy was restructured after the model of the British East India Company. The cost of goods, which would otherwise be skyrocketing, was lowered in essence by looting the caloric intake of the populations of the developing world. This did not reduce the effects of inflation so much as spread it globally. Meanwhile, U.S. production was gutted even further, literally packed up and shipped overseas, where an underfed, undereducated, overworked labor force cheapened the immediate costs of production. At the same time, a move was made to addict the American population to lines of credit.
The first thing you do is you make sure that they don't earn enough money to buy what they need without taking on debt. And that comes from killing the productive side of the economy. So that instead of having high-paying manufacturing jobs, a lot of high-paying jobs, you have these low-paying service jobs, retail jobs, things like that. And with globalization, we've seen a continual downward push on wages, under the theory that we have to be competitive in wages with some country on the other side of the world. This method of using debt to control is very important. And it also gives you some insight, considering how in debt the United States is, of how some of the what some of the levers are that are used to control us.
Over the course of the 90s, the mechanisms created by Greenspan for rolling over the debt continued to snowball. The derivatives market spread across the globe.
Every time they turn around, they will create a debt. They will calculate the anticipated income on the debt that they just created. They will then capitalize the income they just fictionalized. They will take a multiplier factor, say a 3% ratio, okay, it's the corresponding figure. Right? So now you capitalize a debt, an asset of that magnitude. There's nothing behind it. It's only the imagination. So it's like what happened in Weimar, the Weimar 1923. Only in the imagination does this system viable. This system is measured in these kinds of estimations in quadrillions of dollars of estimated value. But nobody ever produced those quadrillions of dollars. They're not being produced now, they never were produced. Which means that the system depends upon the assumed income, like an interest income, on a debt which is not real. So it's not the fact that you have a boundary condition of a finite amount of value. The nominal value is just expanding with no reason whatsoever in absolute madness. Now you're calculating the profit based on the yield, the average yield, on this mass of fictitious value.
This carnival reached its limit in the autumn of 1998.
In 1998, you had the Russian government announce that it was postponing payments on some of its government bonds, the GKO bonds. This sent shockwaves through the financial world. Not because the amount of money was significant, because it really wasn't that much money, but because here was a sovereign government telling the financial markets no. If a government says no and can back that up, then the game is over.
In a desperate effort to re-inflate a collapsing system, the Y2K scam was launched. Consumers were convinced that come January 1st, 2000, all functions run on the two-digit date system would come to a screeching halt. Calendars would roll over from December 1999 straight to January 1900 unless new software was purchased to further inflate the tech bubble. Hotshots with no skills other than website design became millionaires overnight. The NASDAQ stock market index soared, nearly tripling over the next 18 months.
The way they dealt with this was a thing that George Soros referred to as the wall of money. The central bank started lowering their interest rates and flooding the markets with liquidity, trying to get people to buy again. And then you had this scheme to create a tech bubble, to pump up the high-tech stocks, the internet stocks, the computer stocks, and that sort of thing, as a way of getting things going again. So they started pumping a bunch of money into these things and actually created, going into the last half of 1999, a mania. So we went from, oh my God, the system just died, to a mania in a year. And in the mania, the tech bubble mania, everybody was buying stocks. It was, your cabbie would give you stock tips, that kind of stuff, and everybody wanted in on it. People were using their credit cards to buy stocks because the things were just all going straight up. And they just kept going up and up and up until it blew up. And then it was all over. But the effect of it was to bring the system back. It restarted it.
After the blowout of the Y2K bubble, the critical point of discontinuity was reached. The final phases of looting the U.S. physical economy had to commence, and new avenues of money pumping had to be found. The looming specter of terrorism following the September 11th attacks distracted the population from the hemorrhaging economy, while serving as yet another pretense to pump in more cash. Simultaneously, enormous amounts of money were offered to the now deregulated banks for home loans. Banks began appraising housing prices at higher and higher levels, and new housing development skyrocketed.
This is especially the baby boomers. I want this. I want this. I need this. I need 2 houses. I'm going to go into debt to a mortgage to have a house that I like. Huh? And I'm going to get a deal. I'm going to get a good deal. Huh? I'm going to swindle my neighbors, whatever. Then I'm going to buy a second house on the same terms, using the credit from my first house to get a second house. Then I'm going to rent this out to people. I'm going to get rich.
The income streams from these new forms of money printing were used to inflate market values even further, while at the same time vulture funds swept in to buy up the last remnants of the U.S. productive sector. By this time, the electricity grid was wrecked, the steel industry shut down, and the United States automotive industry packaged up and shipped out of the country. In many parts of the country, though reports of inflation were kept artificially low, the average cost of housing began to far exceed the average income of the population.
The system is geared towards producing more and more mortgages at higher prices. That what's called the housing market is actually not about housing, it's about mortgages. It's the selling of mortgages. It's debt farming. It's all about debt. You need a house in order to create the debt, so you build a house. But the purpose of all of this, what drives it, is not houses. It's mortgages.
With families unable to afford new homes, sales began to slow. A new means was needed to keep the bubble going. This came to be known by the name of subprime lending.
In 2005, the rate of increase of new money coming into as mortgages began to decline. And for a system like this, that's deadly. So the rate of the money coming in began to slow. In part because they were pricing the houses out of reach of much of the population. And as we have subsequently seen, once this process stops, everything starts to blow up. So they didn't want it to blow up. So they started easing the terms of the loans to try to sell houses that people couldn't afford to people anyway. The whole idea was to sell people houses they couldn't afford because that was necessary to keep the system going. And that's what the subprime loans were. That's what these Alt-A loans, the low documentation, no documentation, adjustable rate mortgages and all these things, this is all a response to the fact that they had priced themselves out of the market. The housing market was beginning to collapse, and they were doing everything they could do to keep it going.
By offering more and more risky loans to more and more people who could not afford them, the system managed to keep itself afloat, though it was clear to those in the know that at this point the party was already over.
And this was done from the top down. This was not the mortgage lenders, the so-called subprime lenders doing this, because they were merely creatures of the system. I mean, a subprime lender makes loans and then turns around and sells them to some bigger institution. If the bigger institutions don't want them, then the subprime lender goes out of business. But they were just creatures intended as middlemen because they couldn't survive this process. Sooner or later it would blow up. So the big banks didn't really want to do this thing on their own, so they had these middlemen to do it. And that's what blew up. And that's what became known as the subprime crisis.
Finally, the banking establishment began to realize that the situation was untenable. Unable to stop the blowout, the bankers resorted to shaping how it would be perceived. In June of 2007, the largest subprime lender, Bear Stearns, found that its paper was no longer being accepted at face value.
I'm to Bear Stearns. I don't want to create fear. I like Bear Stearns very much, but I think that at this stage, this is not a good call. They shouldn't have done it, and they should have just said, you know what, we're doing well, and don't say another thing. Just don't say it, because it does not inspire confidence to have 10 headlines coming over about what to do. I don't like it. This is about Bernanke. He has to be on that call. Forget the investors. The investors are going to do, if Bernanke listens, Bernanke needs to open the discount window. That's how bad things are out there. Bernanke needs to focus on this. Alan Greenspan told everyone to take a teaser rate and then raise the rate 17 times, and Bernanke is being an academic. It is no time to be an academic. It is time to get on the Bear Stearns call, listen, open the darn Fed window. He has no idea how bad it is out there. He has no idea. He has no idea.
Kramer.
I have talked to the heads of almost every single one of these firms in the last 72 hours, and he has no idea what it's like out there. None!
This triggered a chain reaction, and over 80 mortgage lenders disappeared. The U.S. Treasury and European Central Bank were buffaloed by the City of London into pumping hundreds of billions of dollars into the system by the end of the year, in order to prevent the major banks from going under. Meanwhile, the U.S. population was being primed for a fascist intervention.
Now, there is no financial solution to this because the financial system has in fact died. So the solution is in the political realm.
Today, as the world faces a crisis comparable to that of 1923, the political solution proffered by some is massive cuts in social services, such as health care and pensions. Like feudal barons, financial agencies are moving to assume control over the nation's infrastructure, restricting its usage to those rich enough to pay the rising tolls. This time, the apparatus which would be used is what is termed misleadingly a public-private partnership.
A public-private partnership is a way in which a private corporation can take over infrastructure which was built by taxpayer money and then charge the taxpayers to use it. Is basically the simple answer in the context of the way these things are being used today. That the idea is that since governments can't afford to build all the infrastructure projects they need to build, that the private sector will help them out. And that in return for helping build infrastructure, the private sector gets to own it or own some of the income stream from it.
In what is a sick irony, the very same people who have made it impossible to maintain infrastructure now intend to enslave the nation by possessing what little of it remains. In true Mussolini fashion, the actual need for infrastructure development is being used as the sugar coating for hoodwinking the population into swallowing the poisonous pill of corporativism.
Make no mistake about it, we have an infrastructure crisis.
Nonstop television showed us in New Orleans when the dikes, the levees broke, and Minneapolis when the bridge collapsed. But the governors and the mayors of this country every day see at an operational level bridges that are rusting away, and tracks that can't carry high-speed trains, and power transmission lines that can't keep up with demand, and airports that need new runways, and water lines that need backup systems, and sewage plants that leak into the...
This one's for Governor Schwarzenegger and Mayor Bloomberg. How do you answer those that, given both of your records in killer fiscal austerity policies, will just say that this infrastructure initiative is another form of Mussolini corporatism?
Well, first of all, let me just say, whatever you call it, the bottom line is that we need to build the infrastructure, because you've heard all the arguments.
Infrastructure is the most populist thing you can do.
We see now that there is more money in the private sector than in the public sector. So I think it is based common sense that we say, here's a way to do it. I think more and more private investors are interested in getting involved in those kind of projects. I've used an example, for instance, up in British Columbia, where we have seen tremendous amount of buildings going on, where there's a public-private partnerships, and the labor is happy, the political leaders are happy, the people are happy, the workers are happy because everyone is working. So I think it's a great benefit. And that's what we want to do here in California, and that's what we ought to do all over the United States.
I think another thing, with private capital, you can do things that you can't do with the public's money.
It's always more expensive for private corporations to do these things than the government. The government is much more efficient at it, and the government doesn't have to make a profit on it, whereas the private companies won't do it if they can't make a profit. So it's inherently more expensive. And it's not really necessary if you have a proper government credit system.
In aerodynamics, the singularity of the shock front is generated as a result of the otherwise continuous functions of fluid flow. On the other side of this front, the usual laws of aerodynamics are altered. Actions which once caused an aircraft to gain altitude now lock it permanently into a fatal nosedive. The same is true of an economic shock front. The usual economic measures of lowering interest rates, raising interest rates, or issuing stimulus packages are all mere monetary measures which simply serve to contribute to the hyperinflationary collapse.
What they're doing with all of these schemes, the Fed loans, the money pumping, the stimulus plan, all of these things, is basically hyperinflationary. They want to roll this whole thing over.
Once again, as in Weimar Germany, we have reached a point where the solution must be a political one.
We either go to this reform or we go to fascism in that direction. And we have been drifting toward a fascist movement in policy, which was implicitly going toward hyperinflation.
The American population and the world now face an opportunity which was never given to Weimar Germany.
Under our Constitution, with a president and with the backing of a Congress which supports him in this, the United States can turn on a dime. Precisely such is the key to my proposed legislation, which is now before the Congress. That is, you cannot reform this system. You cannot improve it. It cannot work. There's no way of escaping catastrophe globally under this system. None. What you can do, and you can do under our Constitution, the federal government can act to create a firewall in which we protect, for example, mortgages and banks, that is, legitimate banks, chartered banks. We move to protect them absolutely under the same thing as a bankruptcy procedure. In other words, you're putting the system into bankruptcy under the authority of the federal government. That means that no household will have an eviction. We'll sort it out later. No bank will be shut down. No regular bank, no chartered bank will be shut down. They're protected under bankruptcy protection.
Since August of 2007, the LaRouche youth movement has been in a full-scale mobilization to prevent the rise of fascism in the United States. LaRouche has issued a piece of legislation designed to halt the wave of foreclosures hitting the United States population, while at the same time reinstituting the types of banking and financial controls which are necessary for the development of human economy.
I want to speak on an issue that actually has national and international implications.
I'd like to call attention to a piece of emergency firewall legislation that's currently circulating the United States.
For the Homeowners and Bank Protection Act.
I am a full-time political organizer for the LaRouche Political Action Committee.
I also work for the LaRouche Political Action Committee.
I am also with the LaRouche Political Action Committee organizing for the Homeowners and Bank Protection Act.
We're right now in the midst of a national mobilization. Right now the financial ash is falling on our heads.
Huge losses, billions of dollars. We're looking at nationwide millions of homeowners being foreclosed on.
People typically aren't aware that 60% of the assets of all the banks in the United States are tied up in this housing bubble, so it does mean a financial collapse.
The Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and other central banks have thus far had a policy of providing whatever liquidity was necessary to plug the holes in banks' balance sheets.
The exact same process that was done in Germany in 1923, when you had a hyperinflationary blowout there.
This is something which is systemic. It's a global problem.
The good news is we have a solution.
The proposal that Lyndon LaRouche has made,
the Homeowner and Bank Protection Act.
The Homeowners and Bank Protection Act.
And take action by passing a resolution in support of the Homeowners and Bank Protection Act of 2007. So these are the three provisions within the Act. The three main points of the legislation in terms of freezing foreclosures, setting up a system of rental payments, and a transition period where the banks can be recapitalized to actually begin to fund infrastructure projects and other productive investments.
For the federal government to freeze these foreclosures, as we had done in 1933 under President Franklin Roosevelt.
Rewrite mortgages, and this is the big one, rewrite mortgages to the fair value of the home. Not just changing the interest rate, change the principal in it.
One thing you have to do, it's inevitable, is to re-regulate the banking system.
Congress must establish a federal agency to place the federal and state chartered banks under protection.
State governors shall assume the administrative responsibilities for implementing the program, including the rental assessments to designated banks, with the federal government providing the necessary credits and guarantees to assure the successful transition.
What we have proposed is only a re-proposal of something that Mr. President Franklin Roosevelt did.
That's the kind of policy and orientation that Lyndon LaRouche represents. That's what the Homeowners and Bank Protection Act represents. It will be the first step declaring we're in a crisis and declaring that the number one constitutional obligation is to protect the U.S. population, keep society stable in the face of an economic crisis. And then from there, we need to move with a shift in policy nationally away from a system of globalization and cheap labor and back towards investment in making the United States a productive part of the world economy once again.
Send a message to Congress.
Use the power of government to protect populations during a chaotic economic crisis.
I've recently returned from Washington, D.C., where I am lobbying Congress on behalf of this policy. But if you look on the back of the sheet we passed out, you'll see support from across the nation.
To create a groundswell in the country.
They're banding together to fight for the general welfare of the nation. That's the principle of our Constitution.
We were a nation that was committed to the welfare of all people.
The reason why we're here is because we have created a lynch mob for the good, and you guys are a key part of that.
The good news is that we do have a capability, we do have a power, which through cities and state legislatures, we have a voice for the lower 80%.
We're organizers. We organize in the streets 6 days a week, so we're very, we know a lot about what the population is thinking.
We find now, we're in the midst of a presidential campaign, the issue of politics is on people's minds. Being able to speak truth in a time of crisis when most people aren't willing to do it. That and nothing else qualifies one for leadership, which is not a question of position, it's not a question of influence or money.
But at the point that we've reached right now, it is a question of who's willing to tell the truth and act on it. And I think that's something that's going to give people inspiration and give us a pathway out of the crisis.
You're not going to lose your home just because this system is blowing up. We're going to protect you. That's step one. The other side of it, the Bank Protection Act part, is that we're going to protect the banking system. Not that we're going to protect institutions necessarily, but we're going to protect the essential banking functions upon which the economy depends. That you can't have a functioning economy without some sort of an effective banking system, but that this banking system should be a banking system and not a casino.
We must keep what these idiots with their stimulation packages have no comprehension of. What we must do is we must keep the private chartered banks functioning, as well as not evicting homeowners. So therefore you have to maintain the communities and the nation as physically functioning entities. You do that by taking federal credit is provided largely into the chartered banking system. So therefore there's always enough money in a credit system to maintain the system in its physical functions, essential physical functions. People don't die, the pensions are paid, so forth, that sort of thing. But the other thing, the other music, we don't dance to. That's simple.
To buttress this, Lyndon LaRouche has stressed the necessity of returning to a two-tiered interest rate designed to promote the growth of American manufacturing and end the control of predatory speculation over U.S. fiscal policy.
The government controls its credit. It says the government is a sovereign. The government is the only one that's allowed to utter money, utter currency. The government now puts control over its own money that it creates. No other money is allowed to be generated, except by treaty arrangements with other nations. So you control all the money as government money going into the system. So that money is loaned. Now, money already in the system, which goes into the form of loan through banks, will also get the same kind of implicit benefit, because now you have a 1 to 2% rate throughout the entire banking system, private and public. But the speculators are stuck out there, and they're just going to sort of dwindle on the vine, shaking dryly in the wind. And so that's the way we maintain the system, by regulation and by adjustments in these arrangements. And that will work instantly. The federal government has to guarantee the private banks, there's the chartered private banks, it has to guarantee their stability. It has to guarantee the householders living in their communities, in their homes. Those two things must be guaranteed, and some other things of the same type. So you let the rest of the stuff work itself out. Floats, interest rates go, fine, fine. But you have to maintain an international fixed exchange rate system among major nations, and you must maintain the stability of your own internal physical economy. So you're going to essentially dry out whole sections of the market which are going to have to bankrupt themselves as being useless. You're going to get rid of them. But what the concern is, you've got a population of a certain size, communities and so forth. You want to make sure that community, that population is stable. And you let the other things, which are essentially parasitical, die of their own logic. So you have two credits. On the basis of that, by freeing government, the government operation and government credit, from this high-priced credit, private credit, what you do is you essentially create a fixed exchange rate system in the world. Now you create a system where nations, their currency values are fixed with respect to each other. So you put a lid on inflation. Now you can make long-term credit, because if the rate of interest is fluctuating because of inflation, you cannot engage in long-term investments. We need a lot of long-term investments, physical investments, to save the world. So you need a two-tier credit system. And that's the way we used to run things. We ran that. The United States had a two-tier credit system.
The first tier is for productive activities. If we are, at the root of our problem is a physical economic collapse. That's more important than the financial side of it. The fact that our industry has collapsed, that we don't produce things anymore, that we've been living off of our infrastructure. We've been cannibalizing our economy. Okay, you know, if you look at the triple curve, the lower curve, the upper curves, the money curves can go up, you know, hundreds of percent, thousands of percent. The bottom curve can only fall 100%. But that 100% is what kills you. And so you need to start rebuilding the productive end of your economy. And you need to provide money to do this at low interest rates so that what you're spending your money for is not the cost of borrowing money, but you're spending your money to actually get the most productive boost you can, the most bang for the buck out of actual production. That's what you want. You want to spend your money on improving things. Okay? So you have directed government credit for specific projects. These are certain activities that we find necessary, and if you're going to engage in these activities, we're going to provide you with loans to do them at low interest rates, 1 or 2%.
With the sovereignty of the United States thus reestablished, in opposition to the policy of empire, it would finally become possible to realize the vision which Henry Carey presented for the development of the continental United States and the world.
You live in a society where, frankly, everything around you is bullshit. Huh? And if you can say to yourself, hey, this is bullshit, and then you can say it aloud to the people who believe in it, you're making it. You're doing fine. But if you can't, you're going to cave in. You're going to, well, I don't want to say that, you know. I agree with you, but I don't want to say that publicly. I got to go along with this stuff, you know. And that's where the crap comes in.
Reminds me of the Malaysian monkey trap, where they catch monkeys by putting a nut in a jar with a narrow neck. And the neck of the jar is wide enough so that the monkey can reach in and grab the nut, but once he grabs the nut, he can't pull his hand out. And all the monkey has to do to get away is let the nut go and pull his hand out, and then he's free. But the monkey won't do it. The monkey keeps holding on. This is mine. It's mine. I won't let it go. And then whoever put the trap there comes along later, and then they kill the monkey and eat it. And that's essentially the dilemma we're faced with. This paper has no value. This system is bankrupt. If we keep holding on to it, we're only going to destroy ourselves. So the solution is simple. You just have to let it go. And if you let it go, admit that it's bankrupt, tell the truth, then we can turn our attention to doing what we should have been doing all along, which is building the productive side of our economy, using the productive power, the creative power of the human mind to develop higher and higher technologies, you know, to go to a nuclear economy, maglev trains, all sorts of new raw materials to free the world from a lot of the problems we have with the existing shortages of raw materials, although a lot of that is not actually true. But still, you move on and progress, and that's what we can do. We can have a really bright future if we just let this go.